using V's twisted interpretation of Jewish scripts and under the guidance of a man named Jacob Frank. Zvi's following would infiltrate all major religions, all major political parties, as well as secret societies, orchestrating wars and massacres through subversion and corruption, order out of chaos, and redemption through sin.
זעקת, השכמה.
Every action, there is always an opposed and equal reaction. A quote most people are familiar with, but fail to understand that it applies to more than just physics. In nature, and especially the nature of humanity, current events are always based on our actions prior to that event. Nothing just is. That is a fundamentally flawed point of view. This is true in the case of the Jews. So why are Jews seemingly always at the forefront of these accusations? Well, I can tell you one thing. It isn't by chance. The year was 1666. Jews and Christians alike are expecting the return of a Messiah, and for half the world's Jewish population, that Messiah had arrived. Shabtay Av, a Romanite Sephardic ordained rabbi who would change the face of not only Judaism, but the very landscape of the future we live in today. Shabtay Av, a man who saw himself as the very manifestation of God himself through his misuse of Kabbalah and the flipping of the rules of the Jewish Torah on its head, created the landscape for modern-day subversion and corruption. But how did this happen? How did one man convince half of world Jewry to practice a complete opposite of what its religion preaches? For this, we must go back to the very beginning of Jewish life outside the Holy Land.
בשלהי המאה ה-13 למניין אומות העולם החל להתפשט בספרד ספר אשר על פי השמועות מכיל בתוכו סודות עתיקים מימות התנאים. הספר יוחס לתנא רבי שמעון בר יוחאי אשר נפטר כ-1100 שנים קודם לכן. לספר סודות זה ניתן השם ספר הזוהר. את הספר החל להפיץ רב בשם משה דה ליאון אשר חי בספרד סביב השנים 1240 ל-1305 לפי מניינם. על אף שלספר הזוהר אין שום אזכור בדברי חז"ל, הגאונים וראשוני הראשונים, החלו עותקים שלו להיות נפוצים יותר ויותר, ועט עט חדר הספר לתודעת הציבור כאילו היה אחד ממאמרי חז"ל.
Being just 22 and only having a few years as a rabbi under his belt, this news did not make an initial splash in the Jewish community. Somewhere between 1651 and 1654, Zvi was banished from his hometown in Smyrna and excommunicated as the Jewish leadership was fed up with his claims of being the Messiah. It wasn't until 1658 that he found himself in Constantinople, where he met Abraham Yachini, a preacher who is believed to have forged an archaic script that prophesied the coming of a man named Shabtai, who would be the Messiah. It was called the Great Wisdom of Solomon. Zvi was what was known as a Lurianic Kabbalist, someone who practiced the form of Kabbalah created by Isaac Lura, that at the time, contrary to traditional Kabbalah, believed that its practices could influence the world to bring about the Messiah. Armed with the text created by Yachini, he moved to Salonica, which was considered the center of Kabbalists at the time, and was able to obtain a large and somewhat powerful following of Kabbalists and other Jews. He remained there until 1663, then moving to Jerusalem, where he began practicing public acts of devotion and prayer as well as singing for large crowds of people who claimed he had an amazing singing voice. He was often noted to be carrying treats in which he gave out to children, which always kept a large crowd around. Zvi did everything he could to turn himself into a celebrity to increase his power and following. At the time of his arrival, Jerusalem, which was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, was struggling to keep up with its taxes placed on it. Zvi, with his popularity and influence over powerful people, was able to raise the funds and become a spokesperson to Jerusalem for delivering Turkey these funds. With his success, Shabtay Av was considered a hero for the time being, and was successful in growing his following to unprecedented levels at the time. All the while Zvi was spreading his ideas as how Judaism should be practiced. He began to do away with certain practices and holidays and replaced others with his twisted versions based off of his interpretation of the Zohar and whatever else pleased him. All of this regardless of Jewish law.
זעקת, השכמה.
בפרק זה נתאר את הגרסאות השונות אודות מקורו של הספר וסיפור התגלותו לעולם. סיפור ראשון. בספר יוחסין של הרב אברהם בן שמואל זכות מסופר אודות רבי יצחק מעכו אשר חי בין השנים 1250 ל-1340 למניינם. רבי יצחק זה נסע לספרד כדי לנסות לאתר את מקור ספר הזוהר בימים בהם החל הספר להיות נפוץ בקרב היהודים. וכך פותח הרב אברהם בן שמואל זכות את הסיפור בספר יוחסין. ולמען תספרו לדור אחרון, הודיעכם מה שמצאתי כתוב שרבי יצחק דמן עכו הלך לחקור על ספר הזוהר, שכנראה היו דבריו מפליאים ישאבו ממקור עליון. ובהמשך מצוטטים דברי רבי יצחק מעכו. ושאלתי את התלמידים שנמצא בידיהם ספר הזוהר, מאין בא להם, ולא ראיתי דבריהם מכוונים. יש מי שאמר שהרמב"ן מצא אותו בארץ ישראל, ושלחו לקטלוניה, והביאו לארגון, ונפל ביד רבי משה לאון. ויש אומרים שמעולם לא היה חיבור של רשב"י, רק שרבי משה ידע שם הכותב, ובכוחו יכתוב דברים מפליאים. ולמען ייקח בהם מחיר רב, היה תולה עצמו באילן גדול שהוא רשב"י וחבריו ובנו רבי אלעזר.
The Jews' belief that he was truly the Messiah only grew when he married an orphan girl by the name of Sarah. She claimed to have survived the Cossack pogroms in Poland at the age of 6 and was found by Christians who sent her to a convent to become a nun. After 10 years, she escaped due to what she called a miracle, making her way to Amsterdam. A few years later, after moving around and living life as a prostitute, she started to proclaim she was destined to marry the Messiah who was soon to appear. When word reached Zvi, he proclaimed he was promised a woman like this in a dream and sent for her to be his bride. Likely knowing the similarity to the biblical story of the prophet Hosea, he knew this would bring more followers, even those of the Christian faith. After obtaining his biblical bride, on his way back to Jerusalem, he passed through Gaza, where he met a man known as Nathan of Gaza. Nathan soon became Zvi's right-hand man and even proclaimed to be Elijah, or the one who announces the arrival of the Messiah, which he did. In 1665, he spread the word that Shabtay Av was the Messiah as predicted, citing once again forged and controversial scripts, some he may have written himself. He also said they predicted that the Messiah would bring about the Messianic period by conquering the world without bloodshed and return the 10 lost tribes back to the Holy Land. On his return to Jerusalem, the rabbis threatened to excommunicate anyone who followed Shabtay Av. Thus he decided to declare Gaza the holy city and head out for his hometown of Smyrna. This is where the opposition would be at a minimum. On Jewish New Year in 1665, he made the declaration as the Messiah and instructed his followers to call him our Lord and King, His Majesty be exalted. Being in his hometown, he used the power of his following to remove several religious leaders and placed his puppets in their place. stories spread around the world of the return of the Jewish Messiah and brought in tens of thousands of followers who sold all of their belongings, thinking the end was here. Both Jews and Christians flocked to the news, growing his following to numbers as high as 1 million. Though the numbers are debated, it is commonly accepted that around half of the Jewish population was at least under his influence at its peak. It can be said that the reason why so many Jews flocked to such a radical idea of a Messiah who not only changed the way they practiced their beliefs, but was opposed by the leaders of Judaism at the time, is a combination of a number of things. Having bared witness to what happened in Poland and Ukraine just a few years prior, still being under the persecution in many countries around the world, and hearing the stories of the Spanish expulsions from their elders whose great-grandparents went through it, created the doomsday atmosphere that with so much going wrong, the end of days must be near.
זעקת, השכמה.
רבי יצחק מעכו מעיד על כך שהכיר שתי גרסאות לגבי מקורו של ספר הזוהר. גרסה אחת סוברת שאת הספר מצא בארץ ישראל הרמב"ן, רבי משה בן נחמן, והוא זה ששלח את הספר לספרד והגיע לידי משה דלאון אשר הפיצו. הגרסה השנייה סוברת שהספר איננו חיבור של רשב"י, אלא זיוף של משה דלאון, אשר השיג ממון רב על ידי מכירת הספר, כאילו מקורו הוא רבי שמעון בר יוחאי. בהמשך מסופר שרבי יצחק מעכו מגיע לספרד, ושם הוא פוגש את משה דלאון אשר נשבע שהספר נמצא בביתו בעיר אבילה, וכי הוא יוכל להראות את הספר לרבי יצחק כשזה יגיע לביתו. לאחר זמן, בהגיע רבי יצחק מעכו לביתו של משה דלאון בעיר אבילה, הוא מתבשר שמשה דלאון נפטר בדרכו לביתו. בעיר אבילה פוגש רבי יצחק מעכו קרוב משפחה של משה דלאון בשם רבי דוד, ומשביע אותו אם היה יודע אמיתת ספר הזוהר, אם היה אמת או לא. והשיבו אותו האיש, רבי דוד, כי נתברר לו בלא ספק שמעולם לא בא לידו של רבי משה דלאון ספר של רשב"י, ואין בעולם ספר זוהר זה, אלא זה הספר זיוף הוא. בהמשך מסופר שרבי יצחק מעכו המשיך לברר אודות הספר. ואבוא אל העיר תוליטולה, והוסיף עוד לחקור על הספר הנזכר אל החכמים ותלמידיהם, ועדיין מצאתים חלוקים. זה אומר בכו וזה אומר בכו.
Similar echoes can be seen still today, but we'll get into that in part 2. At the start of the year 1666, Shabtay Av had made his way to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. His right-hand man Nathan proclaimed that Zvi would place the crown of the Sultan, the leader of the Ottoman Empire, on his head upon arrival. Drunk on his own hype, he was imprisoned in an attempt to put a stop to the rumors of the Sultan being dethroned. However, not only did this fail, but with people like Nathan of Gaza and other followers spreading the word of the miracles he was performing in prison, his following only continued to grow more and more. His influence was spread as far as Africa and Asia. During his stay in prison, his treatment was fairly lavish, likely due to the bribes of his rich followers. He was given a personal servant, and some of his friends were allowed to accompany him. He spent most of the time further changing the Jewish religion, such as calling for his birthday to be celebrated with feast and eating the fat from sacrifices. He was even quoted saying, "Blessed be God who hath restored again that which was forbidden." Zvi's run in prison was short-lived, however. After hearing of a prophet calling for the return of a different Messiah, he ordered the prophet to be brought to him. During this meeting, Zvi was displeased with what he heard, and rumors of attempting to assassinate the prophet began to spread. The prophet was able to alert the Sultan to what Zvi was planning to do, and the Sultan ordered Zvi to be brought to him. The Sultan gave Zvi 3 options: prove he was divine and save himself from a volley of arrows, be impaled, or convert to Islam. Zvi, knowing he couldn't survive, chose the latter and converted to Islam, where he was paid a large monthly salary as long as he encouraged his followers to convert to Islam. Zvi, his wife, and a core of 300 families converted to Islam and moved into a community together where they practiced Zvi's form of Judaism in secret. The secret Jews were known as the Don May, or better known as crypto-Jews. Word of Zvi's conversion spread and shocked many of his followers, who were now widely ridiculed for falling for a false prophet by Christians, Muslims, and Jews who never gave in to the hype. However, thanks to Zvi's right-hand man Nathan, hope was kept alive as he spread the story that Zvi's conversion was a part of God's plan to bring Muslims to Judaism. Which actually did happen, granted that Zvi was able to pull more and more Muslims into the Danmei. With this news, many of his followers followed in his footsteps and converted to Islam as well. Others reintegrated into Jewish and Christian society, only practicing Shabtay Zvi's teachings in private, waiting for the day Zvi would return as king. Zvi was able to halt the Sultan's suspicion for a while by telling him his actions were to bring followers to Islam. But after being caught singing psalms with Jews, he was banished to where he spent his final days in a small place in present-day Montenegro. He died 2 years after the passing of Sarah. However, his practices and belief people had in him did not. The Danmei continued to secretly practice in their communities in the Ottoman Empire, and Jews affected continued to practice in secret across Europe as well. For the Jews, the generations of hiding from persecution across Europe had helped ingrain and make these actions acceptable to where before such an action would never be considered. The leaders of the Jewish communities thought that his supporters and practices would eventually fade away. But as they soon found out, these people stuck around like cancer. They did everything they could think of to discourage and weed out Shabtay Zvi's followers to no avail, even promoting friends and family to rat out people who practiced in secret. Yet the Shabtaeans continued to practice and even formed small communities scattered across the Ottoman Empire and Europe. The seeds were planted. Zvi gave birth to a monster that would lead to great wars that would forever shape the world far beyond the prophets of the Zohar could ever imagined.
זעקת, השכמה.
סיפור שני. גרסה נוספת לסיפור התגלותו של ספר הזוהר, אנו מוצאים בדברי הרב חיים יוסף דוד אזולאי, המכונה החידה, אשר חי בין השנים 1724 ל-1806 למניינם. בספרו שם הגדולים אנו מוצאים את המעשייה הבאה. ראיתי כתוב מהרב מהרה רוביגו, וזה לשונו. מצאתי בזוהר כתב יד ישן נושן אצל מורי מהרם זכות, וזה לשונו. מצאתי כתוב באמת כי ראש המקובלים רבי נחוניה בן הקנה, והוא חיבר ספר הבאיר. ואחריו רבי שמעון בר יוחאי עשה ספר הזוהר וחיבר בו כמה חיבורים כמו התיקונים. וכשמת רבי שמעון בר יוחאי ורבי אלעזר וכל הדור ההוא, עבדה חוכמת הקבלה, עד שיקרא השם לפני מלך ממלכי מזרח, שציווה לחפור במקום אחד על עסקי ממון, ונמצא שם ארון אחד, ובו ספר הזוהר, ושלח לחכמי אדום ולא ידעו ולא יבינו. שלח אחר היהודים, באו אצלו, וראו הספר ואמרו לו, אדוננו המלך, זה הספר עשאו חכם אחד, והוא עמוק מאוד, ואין אנו מבינים אותו. אמר להם, וכי אין יהודי בעולם שמבין אותו? אמרו לו, יש במדינת טוליטולה, והמלך שלח הספרים עם גיבוריו לטוליטולה, וכשראו חכמי טוליטולה שמחו בו שמחה גדולה, ושלחו למלך מתנות רבות, ומשם נתפרסמה הקבלה בישראל.
Using these twisted interpretation of Jewish scripts and under the guidance of a man named Jacob Frank, Zvi's following would infiltrate all major religions, all major political parties, as well as secret societies, orchestrating wars and massacres through subversion and corruption, order out of chaos, and redemption through sin.
1 century later, Jacob Frank proclaimed himself to be the reincarnation of Shabtay Av and the living Messiah for all Jews. Not even Shabtay Av was as evil as Jacob Frank and his disciples. Jacob Frank rejected traditional Judaism. He reversed the truth and told his followers, since we can't all be saints, let's all be sinners. The best way to imitate God, said Frank, is to cross every boundary, transgress every taboo, and mix, as God did, the sacred with the profane. Orgies, incest, rape, and sexual intercourse with children, including sodomy on young boys, were no longer sinful. In 1773, Jacob Frank traveled to Frankfurt, Germany, the birthplace of the Illuminati. That's where he formed an unholy alliance with Adam Weishaupt and Mayor Amschel Rothschild's banking dynasty. The ambition of the Rothschild dynasty was to win control of the world's gold, central banks, and wealth. The Rothschilds sent John Jacob Astor, Jacob Schiff, and Paul Warburg to America, where they influenced the privatization of the Federal Reserve banking system and the dismantling of the American Constitution. Weishaupt formed the Order of the Illuminati and infiltrated the Freemasonic lodges with his doctrine until every Masonic lodge in every nation accepted it. The Frankist goal was the destruction and replacement of Jewish ethics with a satanic religion based on the exact opposite of Jewish teachings. When this unholy alliance of conscienceless men was seeded, a cancerous war against humanity erupted. With Rothschild financing, Jacob Frank became fabulously wealthy and was put in charge of spreading a Luciferian theology that would be the hidden hand behind future wars and revolutions. Jacob Frank's followers were called Sabbatean Frankists. They practiced witchcraft and occult rituals, including animal and human sacrifices. Lucifer, they declared, was the true God. The Sabbatean Frankists expanded their movement by masquerading as converts to other religions. They converted to Catholicism and to Islam, where they embedded themselves and spread their Luciferian infection as closeted crypto-Jews. The Frankists traded their wives and daughters with members and with powerful non-members who they needed to seduce into their cult. Jewish professor Gershon Scholem called Jacob Frank one of the most frightening men in Jewish history. By 1776, Orthodox Jewish rabbis and leaders rejected Jacob Frank and the pagan invasion of evil that took hold in 18th century Europe. They declared Jacob Frank and his Luciferian followers to be heretics. Jewish author and historian Dr. Henry Makow has thoroughly researched the Sabbatean Frankist movement.
The Sabbatean Frankists were out-and-out Satanists. They believe that they have to defy any kind of natural morality, defy any kind of natural law, defy God, and they actually indulge in every kind of depravity as a form of worship, because they worship Satan. And they promoted promiscuity, and that's where our promiscuity today comes from. It's 200 or 300 years old. There's nothing new or avant-garde about it. They promoted incest, they promoted pedophilia, and every kind of sexual depravity.
America's Zionist-owned media falsely reported that Iran's President Ahmadinejad threatened to wipe Israel off the map. This was a mistranslation. What the president of Iran really said is that Israel is occupying Palestine and has no legitimacy on the world map. Traditional Torah Jews and rabbis agree with him.
זעקת, השכמה.
some will find hard to accept.
Our popular mythology is that the terrible Nazis were attacking the Jews. But what we were never told is there was a great schism in the Jewish community of the world between the Zionists and the non-Zionists. You see, the non-Zionists were the Orthodox Jews who believed you could not have a Jewish state until the Jewish Messiah came. They didn't acknowledge Christ as Messiah, so they were waiting for their own Jewish Messiah to come. Then you would have a Jewish state, and that Jewish state would rule the world.
There is speculation that the revolutionary document called the Protocols of Zion is a secret Sabbatean Frankist document. This document embodies 24 protocols which map out a detailed Zionist plan for global control. The protocols, written in the late 1700s, describe in precise detail the world domination plan that is unfolding today. Rabbi Marvin Antelman charges that the world today is ruled by a Sabbatean Frankist satanic cult that has conspired with the Illuminati to destroy all religions and fuse all nations into one.
I have joining me today Dr. and Rabbi Marvin Antelman. Welcome to the show, Rabbi.
Thank you very much for having me here. First of all, let me say this. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there. I'm not interested in theories. I'm interested in facts. So the scholarship over the years that I've utilized are sources that are impeccable. A man by the name of Shabtay Av, who was born in 1626 and died in 1676, came along and said, I am the Messiah. And he had a tremendous following. When it was realized that his following was so great, there would be problems, the Sultan gave Shabtai a choice. Either you die or convert to Islam. So he converted. Now, there were about 1 million followers prior to the conversion. When the conversion happened, then there was disillusionment among the Jews. But there were some diehard people who set up different cults of Shabtai Av. And the worst one of them was called the Domeh, which was a secret organization. And the Domeh was based in Turkey and in Salonika. And the Domeh gave rise to these terrible orgies that went on, which became part of the immorality theology of Shabtai Av, corrupted later on. He apostatized himself 10 years before his death. So when he died in 1676, he had these cults doing all kinds of evil.
And the reason that these followers of Shabtai Tzvi were doing evil was because what?
Here's the thing. The Talmud says that the Messiah would come when everybody's good or everybody's bad. There is such a saying in the Talmud. So the Sabbatians said like this: it's impossible for everybody to be good. It's easy to be bad. So they turned around the Torah and they said, if you do an evil deed, then you will use up the energy of the universe, and it'll collapse, and you'll force Messiah to come because you will have used up all the evil in the world. So whenever they engage in an orgy, they would make a bracha, and every day they would figure out a way to do as many sins as possible. Like if you eat chaylev, you're chayav karet. In other words, if you eat fat, according to the Torah, you're to be excommunicated from your people. So they would eat fat that was prohibited, non-kosher fat, from a kosher animal, which is chaylev, which is in that category, like eating blood from a kosher animal.
So they would dafka do the opposite.
They do the opposite
in order to hasten the
coming of the Messiah. After Shabtai Tzvi died, one of the most powerful Sabbatian cults, as they were called, was a transformation of the Domeh, the most extreme cult, to Europe through an insidious person by the name of Jacob Frank. He died in 1791. Now the Frankists started to spread and take over entire communities and make them satanic. And you can actually trace a line historically, which I do in my book, to the CFR from Shabtai Tzvi, and another organization called the Illuminati, which was founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. And they were involved also in the French Revolution, which is also well documented.
So what you're saying is that there really does exist a new world order, that it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy.
Right, and Professor Katz wrote a book called The Jews and Freemasonry, which gives a history of the interface between Jews and some of the cults that derived out of Shabtay Av. But the next big cult that came from Shabtay Av after the Domeh organization, which was in Turkey, the next big cult were the Frankists, as I mentioned with Jacob Frank. So Jacob Frank, the Vad Arba Ratzah, the Council of Four Lands, wanted to deal with Frank, and they decided to have a big excommunication on the 20th of Sivan 250 years ago. And there, they made the following rulings. They said everybody that is a Frankist is to be excommunicated.
From the Jewish people?
From the Jewish people. Bastards to the 10th generation, is what it said. And they prohibited people, because the Frankists were into Kabbalah, they prohibited the study of Kabbalah until you were 30 or 40 years old and you had a belly full, as they said, full of Talmud. Only then could you study the Kabbalah.
זעקת, השכמה.
סיפור שלישי. המקובל אברהם אזולאי, אשר חי בין השנים 1570 ל-1643 למניינם, כותב בספרו אור החמה את הדברים הבאים. ודע, כי אחרי זמן הרמב"ן והראש זיכרונם לברכה, אחר כך נתגלה ספר הזוהר, והם לא ראו אותו. ואמרו שספר הזוהר היה גנוז במירון במערה אחת, ומצאו ישמעאלי אחד, ומחרו לרוכלים בגליל העליון, ונפלו קצת ניירים ממנו ביד חכם אחד שבא מן המערב, והלך וחיפש וקיבץ כל הניירים מכל הרוכלים, גם חיפש באשפות, ומצא כי היו הרוכלים מוכרים בהם תבלין. לסיפור זה יש כמה גרסאות דומות, ובכולן אין עדות ברורה אודות גילוי ספר הזוהר.
They said they're women or whores, and they're hereby excommunicated from our people to the 10th generation.
This is what the Council of Four Lands labeled the Frankists, right. Because they so deviated from Judaism and all that Judaism holds to be true and righteous. These people went off and made basically their own deformed religion, and so the Jews wanted nothing to do with them. They kicked them out.
That is correct.
Okay. Are there non-Jews that joined this Sabbatean cult?
No, non-Jews did not join the Sabbatean cult, but the non-Jews did join the Illuminati.
Today, royals, politicians, banksters, and businessmen form the inner circle of the Sabbatean Frankist elite. They live secret, two-faced lives, sometimes posing as religious Jews or Christians or Islamists. Modern Zionism is rooted in the unholy alliance of Frank, Weishaupt, and Rothschild. It has infiltrated world religions, taken over Freemasonry, engineered wars and revolutions, and turned nations and citizens into their debt slaves worldwide. Unfortunately, Muslims, Christians, and Jews do not recognize their common enemy because that enemy is invisible. It hides within their own religions. The enemy also hides within the activist community. It finances big-budget documentaries and movements. The end game is to sell a divisive, anti-capitalist, atheistic message and deliver trusting followers right into the lap of a communist New World Order.
But the Rothschilds in 1828 decided they couldn't wait for the Jewish Messiah, so they started what they called Reform Judaism under Moses Hess. And Reform Judaism said, yes, you can have a Jewish state before the Messiah comes. And the reason you could have it was the Rothschilds had made so much money, they said, we'll buy our own state. So the Rothschilds sent people out to the Middle East to have Jewish settlements, and which is today the state of Israel, totally created by the Rothschild money. And so Reform Judaism then became the cause of a great schism between Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. Now, no one has ever told you this, I'm sure, but you think that the Jewish community is monolithic. In fact, it's split sharply down the middle. But even today, they have riots in the Jewish parliament between the Orthodox Jews and the Reform Jews. And they cannot agree on anything because the basic premise is a fundamental disagreement over whether a Jewish state should even exist today. So in Germany in 1923, the German Jews were quite prosperous and quite happy, and they were not interested in becoming Zionists, and they were not interested in going to Palestine. After all, they had beautiful mansions in Germany, they had symphony orchestras, they had art, they had everything, and they were accepted in the community. As Ezra Pound said, Germany was the least anti-Jewish country in Europe. When you went over into Poland and Russia, you had very strong feeling against Jews. But in Germany, they were accepted and happy, so why would you ever have an anti-Jewish government in Germany? And of course, Hitler, allying himself with the Zionists, he said, after all, you're right. He said, we have the same goals. And so he allied with the Zionist party, and the mission of the Nazis was to force the anti-Zionist Jews to accept Zionism. And this is what the concentration camps were about. They put the anti-Zionist Jews in the concentration camps, and they were placed under the direct administration of the Sonderkommandos, who were the Zionist Jews. So the concentration camps were run by the Zionist Jews in order to punish and get rid of the anti-Zionist Jews, which they did. And of course, that's a part of the Holocaust that you were never told.
זעקת, השכמה.
New World Order, Mr. Rothschild? What? New World Order? Depopulation?
Oh, listen, who are you...
Genocide?
Who are you televising for?
We just want to let you know the New World Order has no legitimacy. And that we as a people are not afraid, and we are waking up to the robber barons and the big banksters who are looting this economy with the Federal Reserve.
Well...
What do you, I mean, the Rothschilds family did start the federal, they divided Europe first, took over Europe, the Napoleon.
Don't exaggerate.
ככל הנראה ישנם עוד סיפורים שונים ומשונים אודות גילוי ספר הזוהר, אך השלושה שנמנו הם הידועים והנפוצים. לסיכום הסיפורים, להלן הגרסאות השונות אודות גילוי ספר הזוהר. א', הרמב"ן מצא את ספר הזוהר בארץ ישראל ושלח אותו לספרד, בספרד הפיץ אותו משה דה ליאון. ב', מלך נוכרי ממלכי מזרח מצא את הספר קבור באדמה והראה אותו ליהודים בספרד ומשם נתפרסם. ג', ישמעאלי מצא את כתבי הזוהר במערה והשתמש בהם כעטיפה לסחורה. יהודי אחר שמצא את הכתבים אספם לספר והפיצם. ד', משה דה ליאון בדה והמציא את הספר וייחס אותו במרמה לרבי שמעון בר יוחאי, כך שלמעשה מדובר בזיוף. להלן המסקנות העולות מהסיפורים אודות התגלות ספר הזוהר. א', הצד השווה בכל הגרסאות הוא שלספר הזוהר אין מסורת. כלומר, עד גילויו, הספר לא היה ידוע לאיש, ואף לא חכם אחד קיבלו מאביו או מרבו. נוכרי ואסופי במורשת ישראל. ב', מבין הגרסאות השונות, סיפורו של רבי יצחק מעכו הוא המפורט והקדום ביותר. סיפור זה מביא עדות ישירה של רב מקובל ידוע, המזכיר שמות מפורשים של מקומות ואנשים אשר חיו בתקופה שבה ספר הזוהר החל להיות נפוץ. בין העדויות הללו, אנו מוצאים את עדותו של מי שהפיץ את הספר, ואת עדותם של בני משפחתו והאנשים בסביבתו. ג', לעומת גרסתו של רבי יצחק מעכו, שאר הגרסאות הן סיפורים שהומצאו מאות שנים אחר הופעתו של ספר הזוהר, ואף אין בהם אבק ראיה למציאתו של ספר כזה. ד', גם אם נניח שנמצא ספר כזה, הרי אין שום עדות לכך שרבי שמעון בר יוחאי הוא זה שכתב אותו. השאלה הנשאלת לאור מסקנות אלו, כיצד ייתכן שצץ לפתע פתאום ספר מזויף אשר התקבל בצורה נרחבת כזו על ידי הרבנים והציבור?
אנחנו? שמעת על המאפיה? זה אנחנו? איך קוראים לך? נעים מאוד, ששון המחסל.
מחסל? הבהלת אותי.